It was supposed to be the beginning of something incredible for both of us. When Ethan got the offer in Seattle, we both felt like it was the opportunity we'd been waiting for. A fresh start, a better job, new challenges. And sure, it was going to be tough to live apart for a while, but we'd been together for over 3 years. I thought we were solid enough to weather anything. I never imagined he'd leave. And then somehow, without warning, he'd leave me behind entirely. When he first moved, he was attentive, almost eager to fill me in on every detail of his new life. He called me every day, sent pictures of his apartment, his office, the view from his building, texted me good night every night. But as the weeks passed, our calls grew shorter, the messages less frequent, and whenever we did talk, he seemed distracted, distant. I'd hear laughter in the background during our calls, and he'd make these offhand comments about new friends or the guys from work, like he had this whole new world I could barely catch a glimpse of. At first I brushed it off, thinking he was just adjusting. But that thought nagged at me, whispering in my mind every night when he took longer and longer to reply. Ethan had always been steady, the kind of guy who preferred quiet weekends at home to wild nights out. But in Seattle, he became someone else. It was like the city awakened something in him. A need to explore, to connect with everyone but me. I saw it every time I checked his social media. Photos of him at breweries, beach bonfires, rooftop parties, surrounded by faces I didn't recognize. I couldn't help but notice the women in the photos, always casually next to him, smiling like they shared some inside joke. Seemed innocent enough at first. Just a new life, a new circle of people. But soon his messages were littered with names I'd never heard before. Had lunch with Sophie. Running to meet Amy and some folks for a drink. It didn't take long for me to start wondering if he even thought of me when he was out there living this new life. I started asking more questions, just simple things. How was his day? Who was he with? But he'd dodge them, laugh it off, or say I was making something out of nothing. He seemed so different, like I was talking to a stranger. And the harder I tried to reach him, the more he seemed to slip away, retreating into his new world. I remember the first time I confronted him about it, late one Friday night after he'd canceled our call for the 3rd time that week. He brushed it off, saying he was just busy with work, making connections. Networking. Networking, that's what he called staying out until 2 in the morning with people who seemed closer to him than I was. When I suggested coming to visit, he hesitated, and my heart sank. He stammered something about how he didn't want me to feel lonely while he worked late. The words felt like an excuse, a wall to keep me from seeing this new life of his too closely. The turning point came one night when he accidentally pocket-dialed me. I could hear laughter, his laughter, mingled with the voice of a woman. They were joking, her voice warm and close, and I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. I hung up, but the sound stayed with me, haunting my thoughts like a splinter. I confronted him about it, half hoping he'd tell me it was innocent, that I'd misunderstood. Instead, he got defensive, calling me paranoid, saying I was overreacting. But deep down I knew. I could feel him slipping through my fingers, already half gone. As the weeks went on, the distance between us grew unbearable. I became someone I barely recognized, checking my phone constantly, scrutinizing every little sign, every delayed message, every excuse. And every time he shrugged off my worries, I felt a little piece of myself break. I couldn't understand how he could change so much so quickly, how the person who had once held my hand so tightly could drift away without looking back. I started questioning everything. Did he ever love me as much as he said? Was I just the girl he left behind, convenient until something new came along? In the end, he never gave me the closure I needed. Our calls fizzled out, reduced to short, obligatory check-ins that felt more like duty than love. One day he didn't call at all, and I didn't reach out either. I realized painfully that there was no need to. He had moved on, absorbed by his new city, his new friends, and I was left standing in the shadow of who we once were. In his silence I found my answer, even if it wasn't the one I'd wanted. He had become someone else, and I was just a memory left behind in the city we once called home. I tried to keep myself busy, to focus on anything but the aching emptiness he'd left in my life. I went out with friends, joined a book club, even took up running. A hobby I never thought I'd be desperate enough to try. But every quiet moment, every time I slowed down, memories of him came rushing back like a tide I couldn't escape. It felt like a piece of myself was still with him, somewhere in that new city, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't reclaim it. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself scrolling through his social media again. It felt like picking at a scab, a painful ritual that I couldn't seem to stop. I found photos I hadn't seen before, newer ones that showed him laughing at a concert, standing by a bonfire, his arm draped around people I didn't recognize. And there in almost every photo was the same girl, a petite blonde, always close, always smiling like she was part of some private world that I couldn't touch. Her name was Sophie, and even though he'd mentioned her before, it had been in such an offhand way, as if she was just another acquaintance. But now it was painfully clear she was much more than that. I wanted to hate her, to convince myself she was the reason he had changed, the reason he'd left me stranded with questions he'd never answer. But looking at her smiling face, I knew it was more complicated than that. She wasn't some villain or temptress. She was just another person who'd come into his life at the exact moment he was willing to let go of me. It hurt to admit that it wasn't her fault, or anyone's really. In some twisted way that almost made it worse, as if he'd been drifting away long before he met her. I remember the first time I heard her voice, on that accidental call. She had this easy warmth, the kind of laugh that could make anyone feel comfortable. Part of me hated her for it, but another part of me understood. I could see why he'd be drawn to her, why he'd let himself be pulled into this new life with her at his side. And somehow knowing that made the pain sharper, more real. It was like all the love I'd poured into him had turned into poison, spreading through my veins every time I thought of them together. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself dialing his number. I don't know what I hoped to accomplish, but I couldn't hold it in any longer. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice groggy and barely awake. "Hello," he mumbled, sounding like he hadn't expected to hear from me. "Ethan, it's me," I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might hang up. "What's up?" he said finally, his tone distant, almost cold. I took a deep breath, gathering what little courage I had left. "I don't know who you are anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't recognize the person you've become, and I can't keep pretending that we're the same as we were." He sighed, and in that moment, I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, as if my words were nothing more than an inconvenience. "People change," he said, almost dismissively. "Seattle changed me, I guess. I'm sorry if that's hard for you to understand." A lump formed in my throat as his words sank in. "Is that all it is to you?" I asked, fighting to keep the tears from spilling over. 3 years, and that's all you can say? That you changed?" There was another long silence, one that felt like it was choking the air out of my lungs. Finally he spoke, his voice softer, almost regretful. "I didn't mean for this to happen, really. But I don't think I can go back to who I was. Not anymore." And just like that, he confirmed what I had feared all along. He was gone in every way that mattered, and there was nothing left for me to hold on to. My heart felt like it was shattering, each word driving the pieces further apart. I wanted to scream, to beg him to come back, to tell me he still loved me, even if it was a lie. But instead I just sat there in silence, letting the realization sink in. "Goodbye, Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't say anything, and after a moment I heard the click as he hung up. Just like that, it was over, as quiet and sudden as a breath. The life we had built, the memories we'd shared, all of it felt like dust slipping through my fingers. And all that was left was a hollow ache, a reminder of everything I'd lost. In the days that followed, I tried to move forward, to find pieces of myself I'd forgotten about in the years I'd spent with him. I took walks by the lake, sat in cafes where we'd once dreamed about our future, and let myself remember all the little things I'd given up, all the parts of myself I'd buried just to make us work. For the first time, I allowed myself to mourn not just the loss of him, but the loss of who I had been before him. People say time heals everything, but there are days when the memories still hurt, when the ache of his absence feels as fresh as the night he left. Sometimes I wonder if he ever thinks of me, if he ever regrets leaving. But deep down I know he's somewhere else, living a life I'll never be part of, and maybe that's exactly where he wants to be. And so I keep going step by step, learning to rebuild my life in the empty spaces he left behind. It's hard, and there are days when the loneliness feels unbearable, but I hold on to the hope that someday, I'll look back on all of this with a sense of peace. Until then, I'll keep moving forward, one small step at a time, into a future that is finally fully mine. The days blurred into weeks, then months, yet the weight of Ethan's absence lingered in every corner of my life. For the longest time, I found myself grasping at threads of who he'd been, replaying memories like an endless loop in my mind. It was exhausting, but I couldn't seem to let go, as if holding on to the memories could somehow fill the gaping hole he left behind. Friends tried to help. They'd offer encouraging words, invite me out, even set me up on the occasional date to get my mind off things. I'd put on a brave face, laugh at their jokes, even go along with the plans they made. But every smile felt forced, like a mask hiding the quiet ache that settled in my chest. Nights were the worst. The silence of my apartment seemed to echo back at me, taunting me with all the unspoken words I'd never get to say to him. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find a small box on my doorstep. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and for a moment I felt a strange surge of hope, like maybe somehow it was from him that he'd thought of me enough to send something, anything. But when I opened it, there was no note, no message, just a simple, delicate necklace I'd forgotten I'd even owned. The last time I'd seen it, it had been on his dresser, left there during one of our weekends together before he moved. The gesture felt like a final, unspoken goodbye. He hadn't even bothered to add a note, as if words between us were now unnecessary, redundant. I held the necklace for a long time, turning it over in my fingers, remembering all the little moments that had once made our love feel so certain. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't even losing him. It was losing the future we'd imagined together, the life we'd planned. I'd built so many dreams around us, and now, standing there alone, I felt as if all those dreams had crumbled, leaving me with nothing but fragments I didn't know how to put back together. Eventually, I made the choice to box up everything that reminded me of him. The photos, the ticket stubs, the tiny gifts he'd given me over the years. I packed them all away, sealing the box like I was closing a chapter. It was painful, and for a while I felt like I was hollowing myself out. But slowly, painfully, the emptiness began to feel lighter, like maybe I was making space for something new, something that belonged only to me. I started going to places we used to visit together, not to remember, but to reclaim them, to make them mine again. I'd order my favorite coffee at our go-to cafe, sit by myself, and let the memories wash over me. Sometimes I'd feel a pang, a tiny ache of remembrance, but over time those moments became easier to bear. I was learning to separate myself from who I'd been with him, to rediscover parts of myself I'd forgotten along the way. One afternoon, as I was reading in that same cafe, a woman approached my table. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place her until she spoke. "Hey, you're Emily, right? Ethan's, well, his ex, I guess." I froze, my heart sinking as I realized who she was. Sophie, the girl from the photos. She looked different in person, somehow softer, less intimidating than I'd imagined. She seemed nervous, shifting her weight as she waited for me to respond. "Yes," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Emily." She hesitated, biting her lip before she continued. "I know this is probably weird, me coming up to you like this. I thought maybe I should say something. I never meant for things to happen the way they did." I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, even a twisted sense of relief. Part of me wanted to ask her why, to make her explain how she could step into my life, take everything I'd held dear. But another part of me didn't want to know. There was no answer she could give that would change what had happened. "I don't blame you," I said finally, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. "Ethan made his choice. You just happened to be part of it." She nodded, her eyes filled with something that looked almost like regret. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I just wanted you to know." With that, she turned and left, leaving me alone with a strange sense of closure I hadn't expected. Talking to her felt like ripping off a bandage I'd been afraid to touch. And though it hurt, there was also a sense of relief, like I could finally let go of the questions that had haunted me. As the days turned into months, I began to feel like I was piecing myself back together. I took up painting, a hobby I'd abandoned in college, and threw myself into creating something new, something beautiful. It became my therapy, a way to express all the emotions I couldn't put into words. I painted landscapes, portraits, abstract pieces filled with color and life. And with each stroke I felt a little more whole, a little more like the person I'd been before Ethan. And then one day, as I was setting up my art at a local fair, I met someone. His name was Daniel, and he had this warm, easy smile that put me at ease in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. We started talking about art, about music, about life, and before I knew it, hours had passed. He asked me to coffee, and for the first time since Ethan, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could open my heart again. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, and I was careful, almost guarded, as we got to know each other. But Daniel was patient, kind, willing to take things slow. He listened to me, really listened, and as the months passed, I found myself smiling more, laughing more, feeling lighter than I had in years. Looking back, I realized that losing Ethan, as painful as it had been, had forced me to rediscover myself in ways I never would have otherwise. I learned to stand on my own, to find strength in my own company, to fill my life with things that brought me joy. And though the scars of that heartbreak would always be with me, they had shaped me, made me who I was. In time, I came to see Ethan's departure not as the end of my happiness, but as the beginning of a journey that had brought me to a place of peace, of acceptance, and finally, of new love. I wasn't the same person I'd been when we were together. I was stronger, wiser, and for the first time in a long time truly happy. And so, as the years passed, I looked back on that chapter of my life with a sense of gratitude. I had loved, I had lost, and I had grown in ways I never could have imagined. And though Ethan was now just a distant memory, the lessons he'd left me with were ones I'd carry with me forever. As time went on, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened with a sense of quiet wonder. How strange it was, looking back at all that pain, to see it not as the defining tragedy of my life, but as the catalyst for something transformative. There were still days when memories of Ethan would rise unbidden, lingering like the faint scent of rain long after the storm had passed. But instead of hurting, those memories began to feel like stories from another life. A part of me, but not the whole of me. I was free of their grip, finally able to see them with a kind of gentle detachment, almost like an observer. My new relationship with Daniel flourished in ways I hadn't expected. There was a quiet strength in the way he loved me. Steady, unwavering, without the flashy promises or grand gestures Ethan had once used to sweep me off my feet. Daniel showed his love in 100 small ways, like remembering my favorite coffee order or making sure I always had my favorite snacks stocked at his place. He was there for me in the subtle, everyday moments that Ethan had often overlooked, and slowly, he became a comforting constant in my life, a person I could rely on without question. It felt strange but wonderfully right, to be loved so openly without reservation or fear. Our weekends turned into a rhythm of shared mornings and long conversations, late-night dinners and lazy afternoons in the park. And though it was all so different from what I'd once imagined my life would be, I realized that somehow it felt more real. I didn't need the thrill and rush of new love anymore. I wanted the calm, the steadiness, the depth of truly knowing someone and being known in return. Daniel became more than a new chapter. He became my anchor, the person who taught me that love could be simple and profound all at once. One evening, nearly a year into our relationship, Daniel and I were sitting by the lake, watching the sunset paint the water with strokes of orange and gold. He reached for my hand, and there was a warmth in his touch that made me feel safe, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. "I don't think I've ever been this happy," I said softly, almost to myself. Daniel turned to me, his eyes filled with a quiet joy. "You deserve every bit of happiness, Emily. And I'm just grateful I get to be part of it." His words filled me with a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, the pain I'd endured had led me here for a reason. I looked back over the last year, at the slow, careful steps I'd taken to rebuild my life, at all the small, tender moments that had stitched my heart back together. For so long, I'd feared that my love for Ethan had been my only chance, my one shot at happiness. But here, with Daniel beside me, I realized that love could be found in different forms, in different lives, and that sometimes the best things were the ones you never saw coming. A few weeks after that sunset, I received a message that brought me back to a part of my past I thought I'd left behind. It was from Ethan. Just a short, simple text. "Hey, hope you're well. Would love to catch up sometime if you're around." I stared at the words, feeling a wave of emotions rise up, unexpected and strange. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave it unanswered as a final sign of moving on. But another part of me, one I'd buried under layers of healing and growth, was curious. Who was he now? What did he want to say? And so, after a long moment, I replied, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop downtown. A neutral, safe place where I knew I could keep my distance if I needed to. The day we met, I walked into the cafe feeling like I was stepping into a memory, one I hadn't revisited in a long time. Ethan was already there, looking older, somehow both familiar and different, like a stranger who wore pieces of someone I once loved. He smiled when he saw me, and though there was warmth in his expression, I felt nothing more than a faint, nostalgic tug in my chest. Whatever feelings I'd once had for him, they had faded into something distant, a part of my past I could look at with calm detachment. "Emily," he said, standing up and gesturing to the seat across from him. It's really good to see you." "Hi, Ethan," I replied, taking a seat and offering a polite smile. We exchanged pleasantries, catching up on the surface-level details of our lives, the kinds of things you talk about with an old friend. He told me about his work, about a recent promotion, about how he'd been traveling and had finally settled into his life in Seattle. I nodded, listening with genuine interest but feeling none of the intensity that had once marked our relationship. And then, after a brief silence, he looked down, fidgeting with his coffee cup, and I could tell he was working up the courage to say something important. I wanted to apologize, Emily," he began, his voice soft, "for everything. For the way I treated you, for how things ended. I was selfish and I hurt you in ways you didn't deserve. I've spent a long time regretting that." His words hung in the air, sincere and heavy, and I felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I felt nothing but gratitude for the journey his betrayal had set me on. Without that heartbreak, I might never have found myself, never have found the courage to let someone like Daniel into my life. "Thank you, Ethan," I said quietly. "I appreciate that. But I want you to know that I'm okay. I've moved on. And I hope you have too." He smiled, a touch of sadness in his eyes, but he nodded. "I'm glad, Emily. I really am. You deserve to be happy." We parted ways that day with a quiet understanding, a sense of finality that felt right. As I walked away, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years, a weight lifting as I left that chapter behind for good. And as I returned to my life with Daniel, I realized that I was no longer haunted by the past, no longer defined by the hurt I'd endured. I was free in every way that mattered, ready to embrace a future I'd built on my own terms. Over time, Daniel and I continued to grow together, building a life that was both beautiful and fulfilling. We moved in together and every day felt like a new page, a new story waiting to be written. And though my past would always be a part of me, it was no longer something I carried like a burden. It was just a memory, a reminder of how far I'd come. In the quiet moments of our life, in the shared laughter and gentle touches, I found a happiness I never thought I'd feel again. And with each passing day, I felt more grateful, not only for Daniel, but for the journey that had led me to him, for every heartbreak, every challenge, every lesson that had shaped me. It was strange, almost surreal, to think of how much I'd changed, how much I'd grown. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it, with love, with strength, and with the unshakable belief that life had a way of leading us exactly where we were meant to be. Life with Daniel settled into a comforting rhythm, one that felt like the slow bloom of spring after a long, harsh winter. Every morning we'd wake up together, sharing small, sleepy smiles as sunlight spilled through our bedroom window, painting everything in soft, golden hues. We would make coffee, sometimes sit in silence, just enjoying each other's company. A warm, easy companionship that needed no words. It was the kind of peace I'd never known before, one that didn't require me to constantly second-guess or worry. Over time we built our life together in a way that felt steady, as though each day was a gentle brushstroke painting the world we shared. It wasn't like the passionate, impulsive love I'd had with Ethan, which had often felt like a fire I couldn't control, a rush I was constantly chasing. With Daniel it was a softer, deeper love, one rooted in kindness and trust. I didn't need to wonder what he was thinking or worry about his loyalty. He was present, grounded, always ready to listen and to share his thoughts with me. He felt like home, like someone I could rely on through every high and low. We found joy in the simplest things, exploring little neighborhood markets on weekends, discovering our favorite coffee shops, laughing at silly shows we'd binge on rainy nights. Sometimes we'd have our disagreements, of course, but even those felt different with him. Instead of escalating or letting things fester, we really talk in a way that made me feel seen and heard. It was as if we were learning to navigate life together, creating a foundation that could weather whatever came our way. A little over a year into our relationship, Daniel suggested something that surprised me. "Emily," he said one evening as we sat on the balcony, looking out over the city lights, "what would you think about moving in together? For real this time. Not just me staying over a few nights a week." The question hung in the air, full of possibility and a tinge of vulnerability. It was a big step, and while I'd lived with someone before, this felt different. Moving in with Ethan had been more of a convenience, a practical next step. But with Daniel, it felt like the beginning of something real, something we were building together with intention and care. "I'd love that," I replied, my heart swelling with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The thought of sharing a space with him, of turning a place into our home, felt like the natural next step in the life we were weaving together. And so a month later, we moved into a cozy little apartment with tall windows that overlooked a quiet street, our shared home filled with plants, books, and laughter. As we unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, we'd pause to laugh about the strange odds and ends we each brought into the space. Daniel had a collection of vintage records that he'd saved since college, while I had stacks of art supplies and more mugs than anyone would ever need. We fit our lives together in a way that felt organic, like puzzle pieces falling into place, and every day our home began to feel more and more like us. Then one rainy autumn afternoon, as we were curled up on the couch, I felt the urge to share something I'd kept to myself for a long time. It was a part of my past I hadn't talked about, something I wasn't even sure he needed to know. But I wanted him to understand the journey that had led me to him, to appreciate the depth of how far I'd come. "Daniel," I began, my voice barely more than a whisper, "can I tell you something?" He looked at me, his expression soft, encouraging, and I felt the knot in my stomach ease. I began to tell him about Ethan, not in great detail, but enough to share how deeply that relationship had affected me, how I'd felt shattered when it ended, how I'd doubted my own worth for so long. I talked about the months of loneliness, the countless nights spent questioning myself, and how I'd rebuilt myself piece by piece. Daniel listened, his hand gently resting on mine, his gaze filled with understanding. When I finished, there was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep empathy that touched me to my core. "I'm so glad you found your way through all of that, Emily," he said, his voice steady and filled with warmth. "It couldn't have been easy, but you're stronger for it. And I'm grateful that you trusted me enough to share that with me." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not from sadness, but from a feeling of release, of letting go. Sharing that part of my life with Daniel felt like closing a chapter one hadn't realized was still open. For the first time, I felt completely at peace with my past, grateful for the pain I'd endured, knowing it had led me here, to this moment, to this love. A year passed and our life together deepened. Each day a layer of shared experiences and quiet, beautiful moments. We took trips, spent holidays together, even started talking about our dreams for the future. And while part of me was cautious, wary of rushing forward too quickly, I knew I was ready to take those steps with him. Then one crisp autumn morning, as the leaves were turning vibrant shades of gold and red, Daniel surprised me with a weekend getaway to the mountains. We drove up winding roads, laughing and singing along to our favorite songs, until we reached a charming little cabin nestled among towering trees. It was the perfect escape, a place where we could unwind, away from the noise and bustle of the city. On the second evening, as we sat around a small fire under the stars, Daniel took my hand, his gaze steady and intent. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with an emotion I hadn't heard before, "I've never been more certain about anything in my life than I am about you. You're my best friend, my partner, my heart. And I want to spend every day with you, building a life together, one that's filled with love and kindness." Before I could respond, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, simple ring that shimmered in the firelight. My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't speak, overwhelmed by a wave of love and gratitude that left me breathless. "Will you marry me, Emily?" Tears blurred my vision as I nodded, barely able to get the words out. "Yes, Daniel. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and we embraced, wrapped in each other's arms under the endless sky. It felt like the culmination of everything I'd ever hoped for, a promise of a future that was ours alone. As we planned our wedding, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me here. I thought of Ethan, of the girl I'd been back then, unsure, heartbroken, searching for herself in the pieces he'd left behind. I thought of the journey I'd taken to rebuild my heart, to find the strength to trust again, to believe in love after loss. And most of all, I thought of Daniel, my steady, kind-hearted partner who had shown me that love could be gentle and enduring, that happiness was something you could build slowly, over time, like layers of paint on a canvas. Our wedding was a small, intimate gathering surrounded by the people who had been there for me through it all. As I walked down the aisle, my heart pounding with excitement and joy, I caught Daniel's gaze, and all the love I felt for him swelled within me. The vows we exchanged felt like a quiet, unbreakable promise, a commitment to the life we'd built together, grounded in understanding, trust, and an unshakable belief in each other. Looking back now, I can hardly believe how much I've grown, how the pain of my past has transformed into a source of strength. I am grateful for every step of the journey, the heartbreak, the healing, the rediscovery of myself. They have all led me here, to a life that is fuller and more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. And as I stand beside Daniel, hand in hand, ready to face whatever comes next, I know that I am exactly where I am meant to be. The girl I once was has become a woman who knows her worth, who has faced heartbreak and come out stronger, who has learned that love isn't about grand gestures or fleeting thrills. It's about the quiet, steady moments that make up a life, the gentle presence of a partner who is there through it all. This is my story, and it's one I carry with pride, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always the possibility of light, of hope, and of love that lasts. As the years rolled on, our life unfolded in ways I'd once only dared to dream. Daniel and I settled into a rhythm of shared joy and gentle companionship, where even the simplest routines, like cooking dinner together or taking long walks on Sunday mornings, felt infused with a quiet magic. We grew into a family, one made up of love and laughter, and soon, we added another layer to that family when we welcomed our first child. A beautiful baby girl with her father's eyes and an easy smile that melted my heart from the moment I saw her. Becoming parents brought a depth to our relationship that I hadn't anticipated. Every late-night feeding, every stumble through the exhaustion, every shared moment of awe as we watched our daughter grow only solidified the bond between us. Parenthood wasn't easy, but it was the most fulfilling journey we'd taken together. Watching Daniel hold our daughter, seeing the gentleness and love in his eyes, made me fall for him all over again. He was a natural, patient, kind, always ready to support and step in without a second thought. And as I navigated the ups and downs of motherhood, he was my rock, reminding me every day that I wasn't alone. Our lives became a tapestry woven from countless small, beautiful moments. There were the milestones that stood out, our daughter's first steps, her first words, her first day of school. But it was the in-between moments that made our family life feel so profoundly right. Daniel and I shared countless evenings sitting at our kitchen table after the children were asleep, reflecting on the day, laughing about the silly things our daughter had said, making plans for the future. I could feel us building a legacy, a foundation for our children that was rooted in love, respect, and an unwavering commitment to one another. Years passed, and our family grew once more. We welcomed a second child, a son who brought a new kind of joy to our lives. He was spirited and curious, always eager to explore the world around him, and his energy filled our home with a new warmth. With each child, with each year, our love expanded to hold them all, and our home became a sanctuary, a place filled with the laughter, tears, and shared memories of a family that had found its way through life together. As the kids grew, I often thought back to the journey that had brought me here. The heartbreak, the healing, the rediscovery of myself, and the love I'd found with Daniel. Every step had been a lesson, a reminder that life was as unpredictable as it was beautiful, that sometimes the things we thought would break us only served to make us stronger. I had learned to trust, to love, and most importantly, to build a life grounded in who I truly was, not who I thought I needed to be for someone else. One day, when our daughter was about 8 years old, she came home from school with a class project. She'd been asked to interview her parents and learn about their love story, and she couldn't contain her excitement as she sat us down in the living room, notepad in hand, ready to document every detail. "Mom, Dad," she began, looking at us with wide, curious eyes. "How did you know you were in love?" Daniel glanced at me, a smile tugging at his lips, and reached for my hand. He squeezed it gently, And in that moment, I felt a flood of emotions: gratitude, love, and the incredible sense of peace that had come from sharing my life with him. Well, I began looking into his eyes. I knew I was in love with your dad because he made me feel safe and loved just for who I was. He didn't ask me to change, he just accepted me completely, and that made me want to be the best version of myself. Daniel smiled, his gaze soft. And I knew I was in love with your mom because she was strong and kind, and she saw me in a way no one else ever had. She gave me a kind of peace I didn't even know I was missing. Our daughter listened intently, scribbling notes with a focus that made me smile. But her next question caught me off guard. Did you guys ever get your hearts broken before you met each other? I hesitated, glancing at Daniel, and he nodded, encouraging me to be honest. I didn't want to hide the truth from her, but I also didn't want to burden her with the full weight of my past. Yes, I replied softly. I went through something that really hurt me before I met your dad. But looking back, I can see that it was something I needed to go through. It helped me understand what I wanted, what I deserved, and it made me ready to find real love. Our daughter seemed to consider this, her brows knitting together thoughtfully. So, it's okay to be sad sometimes? Because it makes you stronger. I felt a lump in my throat, overcome by her innocent insight. Yes, sweetheart, I said, my voice steady. It's okay to be sad sometimes. In fact, it's part of life. And sometimes the sad moments help you appreciate the happy ones even more. She smiled, nodding as if she'd just learned a great secret. She continued her interview, asking more questions about our favorite things to do together, what we loved about each other, and what we hoped for the future. And as I listened to Daniel's answers, as I felt the warmth of our children nearby, I realized how complete my life had become, how every challenge, every setback, had led me to this beautiful place of love and fulfillment. Years went by and our children grew older, each developing into their own unique, beautiful selves. Our daughter, ever curious and compassionate, grew into a young woman who was unafraid to follow her own path, and our son, with his boundless energy and determination, became a constant source of joy and pride. Watching them grow, guiding them through life's lessons, was both a gift and a reminder of how far I'd come. And then one quiet evening, long after the children had moved out and started lives of their own, Daniel and I sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the trees. The world had quieted around us, and I felt an immense sense of gratitude as we held hands, a familiar gesture that still felt as meaningful as it had all those years ago. I never would have guessed life would turn out like this, I said, smiling at him, my voice tinged with wonder. Neither did I, he replied, his eyes twinkling. But I wouldn't change a single thing. In that moment I felt the weight of all the years, the love, the challenges, the laughter, the tears, and I knew that this was the life I was meant to have. It was a life built on resilience, trust, and the kind of love that only grows stronger with time. And as we sat there side by side, I knew that no matter what came next, I had found a love that would last forever. We stayed there wrapped in silence as the stars began to peek through the night sky. And in that moment I realized that true happiness wasn't something you found once and held on to desperately. It was something you created day by day, through the choices you made, the love you gave, and the resilience you carried in your heart. I had finally come home in every sense of the word, and I knew that whatever the future held, I was ready to face it, hand in hand with the man who had shown me what it truly meant to love and be loved. As the years passed and life gently flowed forward, Daniel and I grew older together, our lives unfolding in quiet harmony. Our children built their own paths, finding love, careers, and families of their own. They would visit often, filling our home with the sounds of laughter, new stories, and the little voices of our grandchildren, each one a reminder of how much life we'd lived and how much we still had to share. In the rare, quiet moments when we were alone, Daniel and I would sit together, lost in conversations about the past, reminiscing about the early days of our relationship, the ups and downs, the twists and turns that had brought us to this point. The older we became, the more precious those memories felt, like well-worn pages in a cherished book, each one telling a story we had written together. And as the seasons shifted, we continued to find beauty in the simplicity of each day. A walk in the park, the warmth of our home, the comfort of each other's presence. We no longer needed grand gestures or plans. It was enough to be together, to know that our love had stood the test of time and had grown even richer, deeper with every passing year. One particularly golden autumn afternoon, as we sat on the same back porch we had built together so many years ago, I looked over at Daniel, his hair silver and his eyes still as warm as ever. He reached for my hand, our fingers intertwining, and we sat in silence, simply breathing in the beauty of the life we'd built. "You know," he said softly, his voice filled with a kind of contentment that words could hardly capture, "I choose you over and over again, Emily, in every lifetime." Tears stung my eyes as I squeezed his hand, overwhelmed by the fullness of a life shared with someone who had become so much more than a partner. He was my best friend, my confidant, my everything. "I choose you too," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. 1,000 times. And as we sat there, watching the sun set in a blaze of color, I felt a sense of peace so profound that it seemed to settle into every corner of my soul. This was the ending I had never dreamed of, but had somehow found. It was a love story that had endured everything life could throw at it. A story of resilience, forgiveness, and unwavering commitment. When the day finally faded into night, and all that remained was the quiet stillness around us, I knew that this, more than anything, was what love truly meant. Not the thrilling beginning, not the rush of the new, but the steadfast, enduring presence of someone who had chosen to walk beside you through every chapter, every page until the very end. As the stars blinked into the darkening sky above us, I leaned my head on Daniel's shoulder, feeling the weight of a life fully lived, and I knew that I had found my forever. And in that perfect, peaceful moment, I knew our love story was complete.